I am stepping into my usual host's feet today. Albin's not here, so I'll be your host today. Please join me in welcoming Kelsey and Jakob today to present to us about governing strategies for MaaS in Nordic cities. Before we begin, I just want to tell you that we have more breakfast seminars coming up pretty soon. So please sign up on our website and please attend them. Another thing is, we have this attendance sheet here. Please write your organization and make sure that you have attended. Just make a tick or something, yeah. And for some practical information, there are bathrooms, toilets downstairs. And if you follow the green signs, there are the exits just in case of any emergencies. Now, I will hand it over to Jakob and Kelsey. And enjoy.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having us. My name is Jakob Witzel, and this is Kelsey Oldbury. We're both PhD students at KTH and VTI, and you are at K2 also. And we will talk today about a quite wide subject, which is governing strategies for MaaS in Nordic cities. And we will provide some examples of when a new kind of technology meets society, so to say. Governance is of great importance for how this new technology may contribute to achieving societal challenges and aims. So we will frame our presentation that way and provide some examples from Nordic countries which we have gathered in different research projects, which are a bit overlapping. I'm doing my PhD research within the Mistra SAMS project, Sustainable Accessibility and Mobility Services, which also ITRL is part of. It's a KTH and VTI collaboration among other actors. And you are working with?
Yes, and some of the research that I present comparing different public transport authorities' strategies to MaaS comes from a project, a K2 project, and K2 is the National Centre for Knowledge about Public Transport based in Lund, and that's a K2 funded project that looks into the role of public transport authorities in a future of smart mobility, looking at both MaaS and autonomous vehicles, but the research presented here today is based on a comparative study from various city regions across the Nordics that's been done in that project.
So we're happy to be here. About 1 year ago, me and my colleague Carolina, who sits here, also my supervisor, and our colleague Malin Henriksson presented a paper of the discursive framing of digitalized smart accessibility in Sweden, which was about, you can say, how we are talking and describing MaaS developments in Sweden. And based on that, and a study visit to Finland, which Mr. Sams carried out this autumn, who has carried out a quite far-reaching new legislation regarding digitalization and MaaS within the transport system, and some examples of current governance activities regarding MaaS and autonomous buses in some pilots in Sweden. We will provide the presentation today. So it's some different sources, but we hope it will provide a somewhat coherent picture. Last year then, just a short recap about how we understood the discourse, how we are talking about MaaS developments in Sweden. Is summarized in 4 points. The first we identified was that a transformation is underway. Developments are happening, and it's important to be active in the developments to be able to steer them. That's what the policy documents at the national level states. But you can also discuss and further explore what change of the transport system and with which aims. You could state that in one sense it's quite traditional mobility. It's individualized mobility utilizing quite traditional modes of transport. But it adds a digital interface. Provides a promise of a smooth and resource efficient and sustainable transport system. So it's a positive agenda, optimistic agenda. But at the same time, objectives regarding societal problems of climate mitigation and sustainability, for example, how they will be secured is not as clear in these visionary documents. You could state that visions isn't about solving everything, it's a way of guiding towards a future. But still, these problems have to be solved. A third point is that it's a consensus-based development in Sweden. Public and private actors are collaborating and working to achieve a stronger innovation capacity in the private sector in collaboration with public actors and supported by public funding. But the boundaries between public and private interests are less clear in these developments. Who secures societal aims, for example? Accountability and transparency politically is less clear. Public discussions are quite rare regarding these developments. And it's also a question of how do these developments relate to the formal democratic planning processes in developing the transport system at the national level, at the regional level, and in municipalities, for example. It's quite decoupled from those developments at the moment. And fourth, the discourse states that public actors must adapt to this development. It is an ongoing change, and it has to be supported and enabled by public actors. So it's an emphasis on the enabling role more than to ensure these public values. And we will get a bit more into that in today's presentation. So this was a really brief summary of the discourse of last year. You can still see this discourse in, for example, how Drive Sweden describes their activities. Quite much of this discourse is captured in their presentation paragraph at their webpage. It's not all about driverless vehicles. This is a completely new approach to mobility. We are on the threshold of the radical shift, and it's happening fast. In just a few years, the world will change. We will see entirely new mobility business models enabling sustainable cities. So it's quite clear that these 4 points are embodied by statements like this. And then we come to the MaaS concept in relation to this.
Many of you may already be familiar with the concept of MaaS, but it's always good to go through a definition. And so mobility as a service or combined mobility is often defined as the use of a single app to provide access to various mobility services using a single payment platform. It's an integrative concept, so that's the integration of various modes: public transport, bike share, car carpooling, taxi, etc. So the bundling of those modes into a joint seamless service to cater for the end user's travel needs. So these are the definitions of MaaS that are commonly presented in relation to discussions of the developments of mobility services. But I also want to present them here to show that these are a goal. These are kind of the definitions that the people or the national and regional governments are working with. They're working towards these ideas. So this is something that has triggered much of the work that's being put into the development of mobility as a service. So these are more like an aim, a framework to work towards than a final project. So we discuss kind of how these concepts are under development at the moment. And recently, or discussions about MaaS can be seen to maybe fall into two different kind of streams: more positive discussions about the potentials of this, what it could and should lead to, but also over the past year there have been more critical discussions about what is MaaS really leading to? What does this concept promise or neglect maybe in some of its ambitions? And the background of MaaS could be traced to developments that have been happening over the past decade related to the sharing economy, where various platforms, various influential platforms such as Uber, Lyft, Airbnb have developed, and these are often described as disruptive, innovative companies, which base their services on a digital platform using various, either with Uber, peer-to-peer, or access private individuals can offer ride for hire as part of a platform. And these kind of developments have influenced how people are thinking about mobility today, and the future of travel modes connected by new platforms. So MaaS is connected to these developments as it symbolizes some kind of development in how these platforms come together under one, or as part of one platform. Parallel to this, there's also been developments in digitalization of other services such as music and film. And MaaS is often described as the Spotify or Netflix for mobility. But here we'd like to highlight that this misrepresents MaaS, because Netflix and Spotify can be fully digital, but it's not. Mobility will never become digital. It's about, you can't digitalize immaterial assets. They may be combined into a platform, but there's still a relationship between the platform and physical movement and various mobility forms. Therefore, these platform services connect both digital ways of managing mobility, or they aim to, but they also utilize existing physical infrastructures that have a limited capacity, and potentially have negative externalities. And this is also something that's been brought up as a critique of the platform economy, that the various developments in relation to this, these platform services utilize existing infrastructures that are often subsidized, but don't contribute to, but don't necessarily contribute to the upkeep and maintenance of these infrastructures. Aggregated services become marketized, and data is processed through algorithms. And new developments related to big data and algorithms is another discourse that plays into how people talk about the future of mobility. There's a lot of discussion about what we can learn from big data, but it's important to remember that these algorithms represent data selectively and asymmetrically. Algorithms are not necessarily neutral. They're coded. They are coded according to different logics, and these processes are also black boxed in terms of who knows what about how these processes developed, who has access to the platform. Is it an open access platform, or is it a private company that owns the platform? Therefore, this raises possible power, transparency, and control effects related to these developments in the platform economy. And as mentioned, there's a new kind of overlap between the digital and the physical, and flows that were once structured by physical infrastructure are now increasingly influenced by how we understand software and data flows.
And some critical researchers regarding the platform economy also takes a further critical stance in stating that platforms are about managing and extracting value from data. It can be positive, of course, creating new services and solutions, but it can also be a way of controlling data flows and thereby become a network rentier, so to say. If you control the data flows, utilizing publicly available services, you can earn money on each transaction and thereby have a steady money flow without investing in the physical assets themselves. For example, the transport infrastructure of roads and rails, or in buses or trains, for example. So platforms are, by these researchers, understood as establishing a new economic meta layer which lies above the infrastructure which we are utilizing and publicly providing. It can be understood thereby as an apparatus of value capture. This is the critical point, only looking at possible interests of platform economists, so to say. Of course, there are other values connected to this too, which may contribute to sustainable development. But it's important to keep these interests in mind when discussing platform-driven mobility, so to say. A second critical stream, which has also evolved a lot in the last year, you could say, is the risk of non-sustainable travel coming from mass developments. There is potentiality of reaching sustainability, but it's all about governance, you could say. There may be business models aiming at maximized mobility and maximizing the transactions, as it is the transactions that create value in this economy, so to say. And also a risk of favoring the most profitable transport mode, which may not be the sustainable modes, but rather, for example, car hire or carpooling. There may also be a false promise of individual freedom in the discussions regarding mass, because the transport system has restricted capacity and environmental and social externalities, like climate emissions, for example. It isn't an asset like Spotify or Netflix, which you can share unlimitedly, so to say. Yeah, thank you. There is a risk of decreased public transport travel and possibly a self-enforcing negative spiral if it would be a development where in certain neighborhoods travelers are taken from public transport services to, for example, car-based services. And with a decreased ridership in that area, the motivation for keeping up bus services, for example, may erode. And there are risks of social distribution of the benefits. Will MaaS solutions mainly be introduced in areas of quite dense neighborhoods where accessibility and mobility is already high, while the potential of MaaS as a complement to public transport is stronger in peripheral geographical areas, for example, in the outer suburbs of cities, in rural areas, for example. And what about then the social economic distribution? Because geographical proximity and social economic dimensions often are connected to each other. So that about two critical streams which complement the hopes and possibilities connected to MaaS. That as a theoretical background and introduction, and we will now turn to some Nordic examples then. And we can have this question in mind. How will traditional transport modes and infrastructures then, how will they be affected in this new mobility landscape? Some theorists state that, for example, Pangborn, who has written about governance of smart mobility has stated that to optimize MaaS from a systems perspective, there is need for very strong governing and control. The Nordic examples then, we could turn first to Finland, which has been recurrently stated to be a forerunner in MaaS developments. They are at least 1 hour ahead. Haha, it's a bad joke, but but they actually are. In Finland, one should understand MaaS as part of the wider marketization of the transport system and liberalization. In the recent 3 years, they have achieved a far-reaching marketization of the whole transport sector in Finland. And the background was not sustainability at first hand. It was the economic crisis of 2008, which affected, for example, Nokia heavily. Strong budget cuts all over the national spending budget. Increasing deficits in infrastructure maintenance of national road and rail in Finland. And there was an agenda formed in politics of utilizing digitalization, innovation, new export markets, and aiming at achieving a decreased public commitment in infrastructure and transport provision. That is, lowering the costs of maintenance of road and rail and lowering the subsidies of public transport in Finland. So it was an austerity policy, so to say, that drove these developments in Finland. In these developments, the taxi market has been deregulated. Train services are to be deregulated in the coming years. And there have been introduced simplified permissions to carry out public transport services, taxi and small-scale freight services. So also you can combine in a new way having one vehicle both as a taxi and a minibus, for example, and utilizing it differently in different times of the day, for example. So the legislative framework for MaaS, which Finland has become quite famous for in the last years, should be seen as a part of these wider economic liberalizations. It's one piece of the puzzle. Transport providers are by law now required to provide timetables and tickets to third parties. So anyone can package a mobility offer with single journey tickets from public transport providers all over Finland. And there's also the establishment now of a new national database and development of ticketing and information APIs. So all service providers, taxi providers and so on are required to provide their service hours to these databases. So the idea is that this may create increased opportunities to develop new services by utilizing this open data and ticketing. And there's a strong focus, as I stated, on innovation and these cuts in public spending and export opportunities. It's a macroeconomic agenda, so to say, of utilizing the transport system in new ways. This reform agenda has been strongly decisive politically. And Minister Ann Berner has been a key figure according to all respondents we met in Finland. The reforms have been quick and decisive, although they have met with resistance from some public actors, for example, public transport authorities, who see more risks of this development when it comes to their own services and keeping them up. Although they have now a legal framework in place, which is perhaps the most far-reaching in the world when it comes to having to offer tickets, so to say, which makes it possible to develop new services. Ann Berner still points at the need to actually achieve a transformation of the transport system, making things happen. She states that now the legal framework is in place. Now it's time for implementation. Now government agencies and municipalities must learn to understand the market and better support implementation. There is still barriers for this development. So the question of actually making it happen is still as present in Finland as in other countries, which is interesting. They have one piece of the puzzle in place, but many still remain, as in Sweden and other countries. But you can certainly say that Finland has adopted a centrally steered top-down agenda, so to say. Some MaaS services are in place, but the impact in Finland are still uncertain. A few MaaS services have been launched, also in just a few cities at the moment. There are unclear effects on travel patterns and user perceptions of these services. For example, Whim, which is the first full-scale service in the world, which is launched in Helsinki and 3 more cities around Europe, subsidizes journeys up to 1/3 of the price for taxi, for example. So many people utilize this to get cheaper taxi rides or public transport rides. But it's really hard to do research on this as the actual promise of this, so to say. It doesn't reflect the real cost of travel. And there are a real lack of available or empirical data and evaluations. There's no plan to evaluate the legislation and its impacts from an environmental and user perspective, for example. And not much research done by research institutions either. It's also expressed that there are still barriers for expansion. Most regions don't have the technological or organizational requirements in place yet for MaaS to spread to more cities, and only a few cities are perceived by most actors as large enough markets. In Finland, perhaps 2 or 3 cities are deemed to be interesting for the larger actors around these, at least. I should say that there are different MaaS actors, so possibly there are other MaaS actors who will be interested in the rural and small city market. There are some indications, though, of impoverished taxi services in rural areas due to the deregulation. Previously, they had to sustain a minimum service level as a monopolist taxi company. Now that is taken away. And in practice, there seems to be quite modest developments despite what you could call a hype regarding Finland at the moment.
Yes, and to introduce more about the regional developments here, as Jacob mentioned, the public transport authorities in Finland are dealing with the national level decisions about the legislation or the formal act on new transport services. So for HSL, the Regional Transport Authority in Helsinki, their work on MaaS is very much influenced by the national work that's been done to make space for private actors such as MaaS Global, who are the company responsible for Whim. And this has been happening in Finland since 2011, 2012. And the PTAs have been asked to formally open their APIs through the new Act on Transport Services. So they see themselves as an enabler and an active collaborator, but the way they work on MaaS is very much connected to, as Jacob said, a top-down decision to open or to work with MaaS on a national level. But HSL have an open MaaS platform and open MaaS API. So if you go into their website, you can find a lot of information. If, say, you wanted to sell their tickets, they have detailed information about how you can use their app. And this API is so that anyone, here's a quote from someone working at HSL, that the API is so that anyone from anywhere in the world, without having to specifically negotiate with HSL, can use one of their single tickets, and now even a day ticket from their API interface. And so this is a unique step for Finland to have this extremely open approach to APIs and access to their single tickets. And even though internationally discussions about developments in Finland have been dominated by discussions of Whim as a Finnish actor, HSL on a regional level has also been trying to pilot MaaS locally or regionally, and they introduced a contest last year for new mobility services and have their own idea lab. So they decided on 2 new pilots that they're going to test regionally in the Helsinki area to see how those services combine with their own services. So the developments there in Finland, you can see, are double. People are trying to find their own ways in this new market that is both happened at a national level and impacts regional actors in different ways.
And speaking of Whim, Whim can be seen as an example of the problem of governing, because it's so hard to know how people will behave in relation to these services and how they are packaged and distributed. Whim sells mobility as a subscription, but also as a pay-as-you-go, pay every time, so to say, solution. They are launched in a handful of cities today: Helsinki, Antwerp, and West Midlands. There are big differences in the services available in each city, reflecting how, the context of governing there and the possibilities of packaging public transport and other modes of transport. It also reflects problems of scaling up in practice when you meet a specific context in every city around the world. Does it then contribute to sustainability? They offer free packages, then Whim to go, where you pay per ride. Whim Urban, which is you pay a subsidized fee or lower fee per taxi ride, and you have the public transport services included. Then you have the Whim Unlimited of 500 euros a month, which is a substantial amount, but then you have unlimited taxi rides up to a certain number of kilometers. And how would these packages handle sustainability issues, for example? What would the effects be? Clearly there is need of research and evaluation here, which isn't in place in Finland at the moment, unfortunately. And possibly there aren't many that are buying into this quite expensive package, of course. But it's not known, but it points at the governance challenges when it comes to sustainability. And in Finland, generally, key issues regarding sustainability are left unanswered at the moment. Are new solutions then contributing to this sustainable development? How do the political level guard policy objectives? Apparently not that much at the moment in Finland. Evaluation is missing, as well as a political preparedness to act if developments go in the wrong direction. Public agencies state that they have their hands full just implementing the new legislation. For example, public transport authorities and the Finnish transport administration at the national level state that they can't do any evaluation at the moment. They just have to get everything in place for to achieve the legislative demands. And economically, it's also still unanswered in Finland. Is there real business viability? So that is still the policy landscape, which is interesting. And from Finland we move westwards.
So now, from a national level, we'll go down to more regional levels again to look at how strategies for MaaS have been implemented, or how different public transport authorities are working with mobility as a service in Oslo, Copenhagen, and Stockholm, and Sweden in general. But to start with, Ruter in Oslo have a new department to work with these, the changes that have been developing in what is often called the smart mobility transition. So MaaS, combined mobility, on-demand transport, and AVs all fall under this department for mobility, and they've invested in. They have quite a lot of people working there, which is interesting, because in other cities, for example in Helsinki, there's 5 or 6 people working with MaaS, but at Ruter they have quite a large department working with these questions. And as part of this work, there's a lot of focus on understanding customer needs and testing different mobility solutions and digital applications with a variety of user groups. So that could be how older members of the population understand digitalization and how that is used by them, as well as how different forms of transport can fit with maybe a family's daily routine, etc. and Ruta have an internal pilot roadmap where they plan to test these different pilots in parallel, both MaaS, self-driving vehicles, and on-demand transport, to understand and learn from these developments and launch them into a larger scale pilot in 2021. So Ruta is trying to learn a lot themselves from these developments and act as an aggregator and developer for the mobility as a service concept before they open up, for example, their APIs. They're reluctant to do that before they themselves have understood what their role could be or is in the future of mobility. And here's a quote from a consultant at Ruta, who said that Ruta is going to be discussed as an aggregator of mobility solutions. And they're also thinking about a journey that Ruta has to do as a public transport authority, from a supplier of traditional public transport to a supplier of mobility. So at Ruta, the discussions related to mobility as a service and self-driving vehicles are connected to a broader discussion about what's our role in this future landscape. How do we want to develop and understand how these different types of services work for us, or how can we develop them in relation to customers in Oslo. And in Copenhagen, in Denmark, Movia is the public transport authority there, but their role in relation to MaaS changed recently because of a national strategy or national decision that was made by the Ministry of Transport to develop a national travel plan, the Rejseplanen, and a smart card for payment, the Rejsekort. So those are going to be integrated and developed as a national plan to develop mobility as a service. So there, Movia will be one of, I think, 34 different regional actors who own this platform. So in Denmark, the developments of MaaS therefore are happening in connection with an already established national platform, which, for example, has different implications compared to other regions or cities that are developing MaaS platforms from scratch. This platform is a brand and platform that's been around for 20 years already. So from Movia's point of view, yes, they want to support MaaS as long as and as far as we can. And they recognize that in Denmark they have a platform already and a well-established brand in Rejseplanen, so why not utilize that?
Going back to Sweden at the national level, we can say that we are quite non-decisive at the moment. We are working in consensus collaborations at the national level, but we are not making any definitive decision compared to Finland, for example. National support is provided by supporting pilots and demonstration projects with funding on the one hand, and on the other hand also preparing common agendas and supporting a successive advancement of MaaS and coordinating activities by roadmaps. So taking one step at a time, but having a long-term perspective in these developments. But although we are not making any definite decisions at the moment, these efforts may still be understood as political. There is a possible lock-in of certain technologies, for example, which are utilized in pilots. And there is a possibility of path dependence in governance, that how certain regions or municipalities in Sweden act now may influence others. So it may have great importance for the future developments, how we are carrying out things in these collaborative developments. In Sweden at the moment, the major city regions are planning and carrying out pilots, but in a more bottom-up way than the national steering in Finland, so to say. So the collaborative agenda at the national level meets the bottom-up agenda of regions wanting to explore this, public transport authorities. So there are connections, but they are quite loose compared to Finland, for example. There were actions in Samtrafiken, for example, with the white paper to achieve more than one has done, a national MaaS model, so to say, but that was halted also due to non-decisive attitudes of regional actors, for example. Public transport authorities were not certain they wanted to take that step yet. So we are more regionalized in Sweden now, doing things a bit differently in different regions, although there are national coordination efforts. And compared to Finland, many of their reforms are already in place in Sweden. We have had deregulated taxi markets for decades and deregulated railway markets for 1 decade approximately. We have a national travel planner and a ticket collaboration, although they aren't totally integrated yet. But possibly there are stronger national steering ahead in Sweden. Since the election, we have a new infrastructure ministry, which resembles the Finnish in the way that we are under one roof. The interests of infrastructure, digitalization, and energy supply are connected to each other, so to say, much more strongly than before. And in the political Januariöverenskommelsen, the political agenda, it's stated that we will have a national ticketing system in place in 2022. So that is much more of top steering than before, at least.
As Jacob mentioned, the different public transport authorities in Sweden have divided into their own individual programs to pilot mobility as a service in different ways. So I just wanted to briefly give an example of one of the pilots happening in Stockholm, where the public transport authority has decided to test 4 different pilots, and these are supposed to learn different things about the business of MaaS from these. And one of these is a project for mobility as a service happening in Barkarbystaden in Järfälla, together with the municipality and the bus operator Movia. And this is part of a larger project that also is testing self-driving shuttle buses that you might have seen on the news, and plans for a bus rapid transit line between Barkarbystaden and Akalla. So in the context of this, MaaS is part of a wider project to develop various different forms of mobility. And this is seen as interesting by the Public Transport Authority, as it's an area under development and a chance to maybe test MaaS and launch a MaaS pilot in an area where people might be changing their travel plans, they're moving to a new area, and it's an opportunity to develop public transport in tandem with urban development, which often comes at a later stage. And here Nobina has a key role as they're responsible for building the mobility as a service platform. And central to these discussions are questions about how to sell digital tickets as part of the platform. And this is an example of how decisions that are made within pilots affect the development of MaaS, even if it's just a test. So SL's decision to open up their API and sell digital tickets is within this pilot, but with unclear implications of what happens after this, or the developments of this. But interestingly, these developments are also happening in close collaboration with the municipality. So here, this development of MaaS is a context where MaaS is shaped in relation to a specific context. So it'll be interesting to follow how that develops. Yes, and this table is supposed to give an overview of the more the regional actors and their strategies and ways of working with MaaS, to just highlight that mobility is a concept that has different forms, even if, as I presented at the beginning, it's a concept that's often stated it's an app, it's a way to bundle transport modalities, but in reality that takes on very different shapes and forms depending on the context. And I know we only have 5 minutes left, so I'll just quickly round off. But you can see that in Sweden, these kind of pilot strategies, as Jacob already said, happen at both a bottom-up and national level and then from a national level. In Oslo, the regional roadmap is key to developing mobility as a service. In Finland, there's an overlap between decisive or divisive national strategies, but also attempts from the regional authority to understand more about mobility as a service through pilots. And in Copenhagen, in general, there's more of a question about what will mobility as a service develop into when it's connected to an already established national platform. Yes, and some final reflections. How can we think about securing public values and influence in the development of mobility as a service? In general, governance research so far has focused on the implementation of mobility as a service. How do we implement this concept? But is there a need to rethink this and ask why mobility as a service instead of we need to implement this concept? What will this concept give to our to ways that we already work and goals that we have, and what role should MaaS take in these developments? It's also important to think about how the work being done with mobility as a service today influences the developments to come, even if these are seen as steps to learn about MaaS. This could lead to a path dependence and technological lock-ins, even if no specific decisions are made.
And there are clear opportunities and possibilities of MaaS, but as we have seen, research also highlights quite substantial risks of developments if it affects travel behavior of users in a negative way from a sustainability or social point. So if MaaS takes off, you could state that we can't afford to get it wrong. And that means that platform interests and public objectives for the transport system may not smoothly go together, so to say. They may even contradict each other. Can this be reconciled? That is the key question. Can you have a platform economy that also supports public objectives? How do we make certain then that MaaS becomes more than a revenue stream for platforms based on public assets and services? That is a key question. And how do we then utilize and govern MaaS to support sustainable travel besides supporting MaaS developments? And talking about opportunities and risks and these value-laden questions also possibly call for wider public transparency and influence and control, making it more political, so to say, a part of the political transport agenda. In the literature, when discussing digitalization and platforms more generally, there is a stream of thought calling for digital commons, opening up algorithms and platforms and control over platforms and data to the public or to representative democratic parliaments and so on. You could see that as an ideal type or extreme type of governance with to reflect on where do we stand today and where are we going. Open algorithms, ownership and public deliberation and political debate could secure the public values in these developments. So based on these brief examples and the overview, we hope we have deepened the discussions regarding how can MaaS promote sustainable travel, which is a key question but is still unanswered, and how can society then secure such a sustainable development and utilizing MaaS in such a way. Thank you very much.